This story, while fictionalized, is based on documented experiences of numerous former Jehovah's Witnesses who have found the courage to ask difficult questions and seek honest answers. The names and specific details have been altered, but the patterns of institutional response are drawn from extensive documentation of actual events. My name is Paul Martinez, and what I'm about to share fundamentally altered not just my worldview, but my understanding of institutional power, cognitive dissonance, and the price of intellectual honesty. 3 years ago, I was a 28-year-old software engineer living in Portland, Oregon, wrestling with existential questions that my secular upbringing had left unanswered. The catalyst was my mother's death from pancreatic cancer, a brutal, 6-month decline that stripped away any illusions I had about life's inherent fairness. Her suffering was followed by my divorce from Sarah, who couldn't handle my depression and what she called my obsession with meaning. I found myself in that peculiar modern predicament, materially comfortable but spiritually bankrupt, educated but emotionally adrift. That's when I encountered Jehovah's Witnesses, or rather, when they encountered me. 2 middle-aged women, Barbara and Susan, appeared at my door on a rainy Saturday morning in March 2022. Normally, I would have politely declined and closed the door, but something about their demeanor, a kind of serene certainty that I desperately lacked, made me pause. "We're sharing a message of hope," Barbara said, holding up a colorful brochure featuring people of various ethnicities smiling in what appeared to be a paradise setting. "Would you be interested in learning what the Bible really teaches about God's purpose for humanity?" What followed was an 18-month journey into what I initially believed was enlightenment, but later recognized as a sophisticated system of thought control masquerading as spiritual truth. The early months of Bible study were intoxicating. Every Tuesday evening, Barbara would arrive with her leather-bound Bible and various Watchtower publications, patiently explaining concepts that seemed to unlock cosmic mysteries. The resurrection hope, the coming paradise on earth, the imminent end of human suffering. It all seemed so logical, so well documented with carefully selected scriptures. I was particularly impressed by their scholarly apparatus. The New World Translation included extensive footnotes and cross-references. Their publications cited ancient historians, archaeological findings, and complex theological arguments. For someone with my analytical background, this apparent intellectual rigor was compelling. After a year of intensive study, I was baptized at a district convention in Seattle. Standing in that pool, surrounded by thousands of believers, I felt I had finally found my tribe. People who took truth seriously, who lived by principles rather than expedience, who had answers to life's biggest questions. The honeymoon period lasted exactly 6 months. The awakening began during a casual conversation with my college roommate, Dr. Marcus Thompson, who had become a professor of ancient history at Reed College. Marcus had always been skeptical of religious claims, but he approached my conversion with scholarly curiosity rather than dismissive atheism. "Paul," he said over coffee one afternoon, "I've been reading some of your Watchtower literature out of genuine interest. I have to ask, are you aware of the significant historical inaccuracies in their chronology?" My immediate response was defensive. "What kind of inaccuracies?" "Well, their dating of Jerusalem's destruction at 607 BCE, for instance. The archaeological and historical consensus overwhelmingly supports 587/586 BCE. It's not even close to being a debated topic among scholars." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that I would later recognize as cognitive dissonance. "Maybe secular scholars are biased against Bible chronology," I suggested. Marcus, ever patient, pulled out his laptop. "Paul, I respect your faith, but this isn't about bias. Look at the cuneiform tablets, the astronomical diaries, the convergent lines of evidence. The Watchtower's 607 date is archaeologically impossible." That night, I couldn't sleep. Why would the organization use a date that contradicted established historical evidence? I decided to investigate, not to doubt, but to strengthen my faith with deeper understanding. What I discovered shattered my carefully constructed worldview. The 607 BCE date wasn't just wrong. It was deliberately maintained despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary because changing it would undermine their entire 1914 doctrine. And 1914 was the linchpin of their claim to divine authority. Remove 1914, and their entire prophetic interpretation collapsed. I spent weeks diving deeper into Watchtower history using their own older publications, many available online through digital archives. What I found was a pattern of failed predictions, doctrinal reversals, and revisionist history that would have impressed Orwell. 1925. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were supposed to be resurrected. They even built a mansion in San Diego called Beth Sarim for these ancient patriarchs. 1975. The end of 6,000 years of human history was supposed to bring Armageddon. When it didn't, they blamed the rank and file for misunderstanding. The generation doctrine. For decades, they taught that the generation alive in 1914 would not pass away before Armageddon. As that generation died off, they redefined generation. So many times it became essentially meaningless. Blood doctrine changes. Components that were once forbidden became acceptable in a complex matrix of contradictions that made little medical or theological sense. Each discovery hit like a physical blow. These weren't minor adjustments. They were fundamental failures of divine guidance. Armed with this information, I began asking questions during Watchtower study sessions and in informal conversations with fellow believers. My approach was careful, respectful. I genuinely wanted to understand how to reconcile these historical facts with our claims to divine guidance. Brother Peterson, I asked our congregation's presiding overseer after a Sunday meeting, I've been researching our chronology and I'm confused about the 607 BCE date. All the archaeological evidence points to 587 BCE for Jerusalem's destruction. How do we address this discrepancy? Brother Peterson, a man in his 50s who had been an elder for over 20 years, gave me the standard response. Brother Paul, we must remember that worldly scholars are influenced by Satan's system. They deliberately distort evidence to undermine Bible chronology. But brother, I pressed gently, these aren't just a few scholars. It's the entire archaeological community, including believers. And the evidence from multiple independent sources all converges on 587 BCE. I watched his expression shift from patient instruction to something harder. Paul, I'm concerned about your attitude. It sounds like you're trusting human wisdom over God's organization. That phrase, God's organization, had become a conversation ender, a thought-stopping technique that I was only beginning to recognize. Over the following weeks, I asked similar questions to other elders and mature brothers. The responses followed a predictable pattern: deflection, appeals to loyalty, warnings about dangerous thinking, and ultimately, thinly veiled threats about spiritual consequences. Brother Williams, our circuit overseer during his next visit, put it most bluntly. Brother Martinez, I understand you've been asking a lot of questions lately. Questions that some have found disturbing. I'm just trying to understand our beliefs better, I replied. Understanding comes through humility and obedience, not through questioning God's appointed channel. Perhaps you need to examine your heart condition. The message was clear. Questioning was a spiritual defect, not an intellectual virtue. It was around this time that I made a decision that would change everything. As a software engineer, I was naturally inclined toward documentation and evidence. If I was going to continue this investigation, I needed to preserve exactly what was being said to me. I began discreetly recording my conversations with congregation elders and visiting overseers. Initially, my motivation was purely personal. I wanted to review their responses carefully and perhaps find reassurance I had missed in the moment. The first significant recording was with Brother Stevens, a man I deeply respected who had been a witness for over 30 years. He had a reputation for being scholarly and had even done some archaeological work before his conversion. Brother Stevens, I said as we walked through the parking lot after a meeting, my phone recording in my jacket pocket, I've been struggling with some historical questions. You have an archaeology background. How do you reconcile the 607 BCE date with the overwhelming archaeological evidence for 587 BCE? His response was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Paul, I'll be honest with you. When I first learned about this discrepancy 20 years ago, it troubled me deeply. I spent months researching, hoping to find evidence supporting our chronology. And what did you find? I found that the archaeological evidence is indeed overwhelming for 587 BCE. But I also realized something more important. Faith isn't about having every detail perfectly figured out. It's about trusting that God is guiding His organization despite human imperfections. But brother, I pressed, if we're wrong about something this fundamental, how can we be certain about anything else we teach? The shift in his tone was immediate. That kind of thinking is dangerous, Paul. It's the kind of reasoning that leads to apostasy. Sometimes we have to accept things we don't fully understand. That night, listening to the recording, I realized I had documented something significant. A knowledgeable elder admitting our central chronology was wrong while simultaneously arguing that being wrong didn't matter. My questions had apparently reached the attention of the local body of elders, because 2 weeks later I received a call from Brother Peterson requesting a meeting. The tone was formal, official. Paul, we need to discuss some concerns about your recent conduct in the congregation. I arrived at the Kingdom Hall that Tuesday evening to find 3 elders waiting. Peterson, Martinez, no relation, and Johnson. The atmosphere was unmistakably judicial, though they maintained they were there to help me. My phone was recording discreetly in my shirt pocket. Paul, Peterson began, several brothers have expressed concern about questions you've been asking. Questions that seem designed to undermine faith rather than strengthen it. I'm genuinely seeking to understand our beliefs, I replied. Isn't that what we encourage in our Bible studies with interested ones? Brother Martinez leaned forward. The difference is that interested ones are learning the truth. You seem to be questioning the truth after you've already accepted it. But what if I've discovered information that contradicts what I was taught? Such as? Johnson asked. I pulled out my notes. Months of research documented meticulously. The 607 BCE date, the failed predictions about 1925 and 1975, the multiple changes to the generation doctrine, the modification of blood policies without acknowledgement. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Paul, Peterson interrupted, where are you getting this information? From our own older publications, historical documents, archaeological evidence. And from apostate websites, Martinez added accusingly. I've been careful to verify everything through multiple sources, I replied. I'm not interested in apostolic propaganda. I'm interested in facts. Johnson spoke for the first time. Facts according to whom? Worldly scholars? Opposers of God's organization. The conversation continued for 2 hours. What struck me most was not their inability to address my specific concerns, but their consistent redirection toward my motives and loyalty rather than the evidence itself. As I was leaving, Peterson delivered what I now recognize as a threat disguised as spiritual counsel. Paul, I strongly encourage you to stop this line of thinking. It's not leading anywhere good. The weeks following that meeting were psychologically brutal. My questions had somehow made me a marked man within the congregation. Friends who had previously sought my company began avoiding me. Conversations stopped when I approached groups. The warm fellowship I had cherished was replaced by cold politeness and suspicious glances. More disturbing was the campaign of subtle character assassination. I began hearing rumors that I was struggling with pride, that I was letting worldly education interfere with spiritual matters, that I was developing an independent spirit. The psychological pressure was immense. In witness culture, congregational approval is tied directly to divine approval. Being marginalized by the community meant being marginalized by God himself, or so the thinking goes. Brother Peterson called me frequently with invitations to encouraging visits, where he would attempt to address what he called my spiritual illness. During one such visit, which I recorded, he made a statement that crystallized the entire dynamic. Paul, you need to understand something fundamental about theocratic order. In God's organization, the direction flows downward, not upward. Our job is to receive instruction humbly, not to evaluate or question it. The moment we start thinking we know better than the faithful and discreet slave class, we've stepped into Satan's trap. But brother, I responded, doesn't the Bible say to make sure of all things? Yes, make sure of all things, except the organization itself. We don't test God's appointed channel any more than the Israelites should have tested Moses. The recording captured something crucial. The explicit doctrine that the organization itself was beyond question, beyond testing, beyond accountability. This wasn't religion. It was authoritarianism with a theological veneer. 6 weeks after my initial meeting with the elders, I received what amounted to a summons. Not just the local elders this time. The circuit overseer, Brother Williams, was back in town specifically to deal with my case. I entered the Kingdom Hall's back room to find 5 men waiting. The 3 local elders plus Williams and another man I didn't recognize who introduced himself as Brother Davis from the branch office. The presence of a headquarters representative told me this had escalated far beyond local concern. My recording device was ready. "Paul," Williams began, "we've been in communication with the branch about your situation. Your questioning of established doctrine is causing disturbance not just in this congregation, but in others where your concerns have spread." "I wasn't aware my private questions had spread anywhere," I replied carefully. "Private?" Davis interjected sharply. "You've been discussing these matters with multiple brothers, spreading doubt about the organization's credibility. I've been seeking answers to legitimate historical questions. Questions," Williams continued, "that undermine faith and could lead weak ones away from the truth." Davis then produced a document from his briefcase. "We've prepared an agreement that will help you refocus your spiritual priorities." I read the document with growing disbelief. It was essentially a comprehensive gag order requiring me to cease all questioning of organizational doctrine or policy, refrain from discussing controversial topics with other congregation members, submit to monthly spiritual counseling sessions with appointed elders, avoid all external research on Jehovah's Witnesses, focus exclusively on positive congregation activities like field service and meeting attendance. Failure to comply would result in immediate judicial action for apostasy. "This is essentially asking me to stop thinking," I said. "It's asking you to stop spreading poison," Davis replied bluntly. The conversation that followed was the most revealing yet. For the first time, these men dropped their veneer of loving shepherding and revealed the authoritarian core beneath. "Paul," Williams said, "you have a choice. Sign this agreement and remain part of God's organization, or continue down this path and face the consequences." "What consequences exactly?" "Disfellowshipping," Davis stated flatly. "Complete shunning by your spiritual family. Loss of all social connections within God's organization." "For asking questions?" "For undermining faith," Williams corrected. "For placing your own understanding above that of the faithful and discreet slave." I stared at the document, my mind racing. "Can I have time to consider this?" 24 hours, Davis said. "This is an act of mercy. Normally, someone with your attitude would already be before a judicial committee." That night was the longest of my life. I listened to my recordings repeatedly, hardly believing what I was hearing. These weren't men interested in truth or even in helping me spiritually. These were bureaucrats protecting an institution. I thought about my options. I could sign the document, return to the comfortable certainty of unquestioned belief, maintain my social connections, and suppress my intellectual integrity. Or I could refuse to sign, face expulsion, and lose the only community I had known for the past 18 months. But there was a third option, one that had been forming in my mind for weeks: expose the entire system. I had dozens of recordings by now, conversations with elders, circuit overseers, and even a district overseer who had visited our circuit. I had documented their thought-stopping techniques, their appeals to authority, their explicit discouragement of independent thinking, and now their attempt to coerce my silence through institutional blackmail. The next evening, I returned to the Kingdom Hall. The same 5 men were waiting. "Have you made your decision, Paul?" Williams asked. I placed my phone on the table between us, recording light clearly visible. "Yes," I said. "I'm not signing your document." The reaction was immediate. Davis lunged forward. "Turn that off immediately." "No," I replied calmly. "I have every legal right to record conversations I'm party to. And I think the world should hear how the organization that claims to represent God's love actually treats its members." Peterson found his voice. "Paul, this is incredibly inappropriate. These are private ecclesiastical matters." "Private?" I laughed. "You're attempting to coerce my conscience and silence my legitimate questions. Nothing about this should be private." Williams tried a different approach. "Paul, if you publish those recordings, you'll be causing reproach on Jehovah's name." "Will I? Or will I be exposing behavior that brings reproach on God's name?" The next 20 minutes were chaos. These men, so composed and authoritative in their normal congregation roles, were completely unprepared for accountability. They demanded I delete the recordings, threatened legal action, warned of divine judgment. Finally, Davis played what he thought was his trump card. Paul, we can make this all go away. Agree to delete those recordings and sign the document, and we'll forget this ever happened. You can continue as a brother in good standing. At the cost of my intellectual honesty and freedom of conscience? At the cost of your prideful independence, he corrected. That phrase, prideful independence, crystallized everything. In their worldview, independent thinking wasn't a virtue but a sin, questioning wasn't wisdom but pride, and accountability wasn't justice but rebellion. Gentlemen, I said, standing to leave, I won't be signing your document, I won't be deleting these recordings, and I won't be silenced. If you want to expel me for seeking truth, that says everything anyone needs to know about this organization. As promised, they formed a judicial committee within the week. I attended, recorded everything, and was unsurprisingly disfellowshipped for apostasy, defined specifically as questioning the authority of God's organization. But something unexpected began happening. Word of my situation had spread through informal networks of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I began receiving messages from active members who had similar doubts but had been afraid to voice them. The first was from a young woman named Jennifer, who had grown up in the organization. Paul, I heard about what happened to you. I've had many of the same questions but was terrified to ask them. Could you share some of your research with me? Then came a message from an elder in another state. Brother Martinez, I've been serving for 25 years, but lately I've been struggling with serious doubts. I heard you were disfellowshipped for asking questions. I need to know what you discovered. Within weeks, I was in contact with dozens of current and former Jehovah's Witnesses, each with their own story of suppressed doubts and institutional intimidation. I decided to create something that had never existed before, a comprehensive digital archive of Jehovah's Witness institutional behavior, using my recordings as the centerpiece but expanding to include testimonies from others who had faced similar treatment. Working with my friend Marcus and a web developer colleague, Sarah Chen, we built Questioning Faith, a website that combined academic analysis with personal testimonies and, most importantly, audio evidence of how the organization actually operated behind closed doors. The response was immediate and global. Within months, we were receiving messages from Jehovah's Witnesses on every continent. But we were also receiving legal threats from the organization's legal department, demanding we remove copyrighted material and false information. Instead of backing down, we consulted with religious freedom attorneys who assured us that our use of recorded conversations and published materials fell well within fair use doctrine, especially given the public interest in exposing institutional abuse. The most powerful content came from active Jehovah's Witnesses who were willing to share their stories under pseudonyms. We heard from a Bethel worker who described the authoritarian atmosphere at headquarters. Multiple elders who admitted privately that they no longer believed core doctrines but felt trapped by social and family pressures. Young people who were struggling with the organization's stance on education and careers. Families torn apart by shunning policies. Abuse survivors who had been silenced by the two-witness rule. Each story followed similar patterns. Sincere questions met with institutional resistance, attempts to silence rather than address concerns, and the use of emotional and social coercion to maintain control. Our website caught the attention of investigative journalists, particularly after we published a series called The Recordings, How Jehovah's Witnesses Handle Dissent. These audio files, featuring my conversations with organizational leaders, provided unprecedented insight into the group's internal operations. The story was picked up by major news outlets, religious freedom organizations, and academic researchers studying high-control groups. My phone recordings became evidence in scholarly papers about thought control techniques in religious organizations. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Stephen Hassan, a leading expert on cults and author of Combating Cult Mind Control, reached out to me. Paul, he said during our first conversation, what you've documented is a textbook example of thought-stopping and information control in action. Your recordings provide evidence of techniques I've been describing theoretically for decades. Hassan invited me to speak at conferences on religious freedom and cult recovery. My story became part of a larger academic conversation about how high-control groups maintain power through information manipulation and social pressure. 8 months after launching the website, I received a call that changed everything. Is this Paul Martinez? Yes. Who's calling? My name is... Well, let me just say I'm someone who has worked at the highest levels of the Watchtower organization for many years. I've been following your story. The voice was older, educated, with a slight New York accent. He refused to give his name but said he had information that would put everything you've discovered into perspective. Over several encrypted conversations, this insider, who I came to call Deep Throat in homage to Watergate, revealed the internal dynamics of Watchtower leadership. Paul, you need to understand something, he told me during one late-night call. Many of us at headquarters have known about these historical problems for decades. We've had internal debates about the 607 date, about the generation doctrine, about blood policy contradictions. Then why haven't you corrected them? Because the entire authority structure depends on these doctrines being true. Admit we were wrong about 1914, and our entire claim to divine appointment collapses. The organization as we know it wouldn't survive. He described a culture of fear even at the highest levels, where questioning fundamental doctrines was career suicide, where loyalty mattered more than truth, where institutional preservation trumped intellectual honesty. The tragic irony, he said, is that many of us became witnesses because we valued truth. But the organization has created a system where defending the truth requires suppressing actual truth. Inspired by these revelations, I partnered with an independent filmmaker, David Kim, to create a feature-length documentary about institutional control within religious organizations, using my experience as the central narrative. Silenced, The Price of Questions took 18 months to produce. It featured not just my story and recordings, but interviews with former headquarters personnel, cult experts, legal scholars, and dozens of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who had faced similar treatment. The most powerful sequence featured my original recordings of the elders attempting to force me to sign the silence agreement, interspersed with expert commentary on coercive control techniques. Dr. Hassan provided analysis. What we're hearing is a textbook example of thought-stopping and loyalty testing. The organization isn't interested in addressing Paul's concerns. They're interested in maintaining control. Professor Lisa Miller from Harvard Divinity School added historical context. This pattern of suppressing internal dissent while claiming divine authority is common among high-control religious groups throughout history. But the documentary's most shocking revelation came from my anonymous insider source, who agreed to be interviewed with voice disguised and identity obscured. The leadership knows about these problems, the disguised voice said. We've had internal memos discussing how to handle problematic members like Paul. The strategy is always the same. Silence them, isolate them, or remove them. Truth is never part of the equation. The documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was subsequently picked up by a major streaming platform. Within weeks, it had been viewed by millions of people worldwide. But the real bombshell came 3 months after the premiere. I was at home working when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Paul Martinez? Yes. This is Robert Chen. I think you know me by a different name. I'm the source who's been providing you information from Watchtower headquarters. My blood ran cold. My anonymous insider was revealing himself. Mr. Chen, are you sure you want to do this? Very sure. I'm 67 years old, Paul. I've spent 42 years of my life serving this organization, including the last 15 as a member of the governing body. I nearly dropped the phone. A member of the governing body, the small group of men who claim to be God's sole channel on earth, was my source. I've watched your documentary, he continued. I've seen the impact it's having. And I've decided it's time to tell the complete truth about what goes on at the highest levels of this organization. Chen explained that he had been struggling with doubts for years but felt trapped by his position and the expectations of millions of witnesses worldwide. My courage in documenting and exposing the local elders' behavior had inspired him to consider a more dramatic step. Paul, would you be willing to help me document my own story? I want to go public with what I know about how decisions are really made in the governing body. Working with Chen was like gaining access to the Pentagon's secret files. He had documents, recordings of governing body meetings, internal memos, and detailed knowledge of how doctrinal decisions were actually made. The most shocking revelation was that the governing body regularly made decisions based on institutional protection rather than biblical principle. The two-witness rule for child abuse cases, for instance, wasn't maintained because of biblical mandate but because changing it would expose the organization to massive legal liability. We've known for years that our blood doctrine is medically and theologically incoherent, Chin revealed in one recorded session. But we can't change it because we've disfellowshipped thousands of people for accepting blood transfusions. Admitting we were wrong would be admitting we destroyed those families for nothing. Chin also revealed the organization's sophisticated monitoring of online activity, including efforts to identify and silence critics like me. My case had been discussed in governing body meetings as an example of how dangerous thinking could spread if not quickly contained. They saw you as a test case, Paul. If they could silence you effectively, it would serve as a deterrent to others with similar questions. Your refusal to be silenced has terrified them. Chen's decision to go public was coordinated carefully. We worked with investigative journalists, legal experts, and cult researchers to prepare a comprehensive release of information. On a Tuesday morning in September, major news outlets simultaneously published stories about a governing body member's resignation and explosive accusations against Watchtower leadership. The headlines were stark. Jehovah's Witness leader exposes decades of deception in unprecedented resignation. Former governing body member, we knew we were wrong but covered it up. The Watchtower files. Inside documents reveal pattern of institutional cover-up. Chen held a press conference where he methodically dismantled the organization's claims to divine guidance, using internal documents and recordings to demonstrate how decisions were made based on legal and financial considerations rather than spiritual ones. The most devastating moment came when a reporter asked Chen directly, "Are you saying the governing body knowingly teaches false doctrine?" His response was measured but definitive. "I'm saying we often make decisions we know are problematic because changing them would threaten the organization's survival. Truth becomes secondary to institutional preservation." The impact was immediate and worldwide. News of a governing body member's public resignation and accusations sent shockwaves through Jehovah's Witness communities globally. My website crashed from traffic volume as millions of people sought to access Chen's documents and my original recordings. News outlets around the world covered the story, with many comparing it to the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandals in terms of institutional credibility crisis. But the most significant impact was within Jehovah's Witness congregations themselves. Elders were fielding unprecedented numbers of questions from concerned members. Families were having conversations about doubts they had suppressed for years. Young people were openly questioning whether they wanted to continue in the organization. The Watchtower's response was predictable. They disfellowshipped Chan in absentia, declared him mentally diseased, and launched a campaign warning witnesses against apostate propaganda designed to destroy faith. But it was too late. The dam had burst. I received thousands of messages from witnesses around the world. "Paul, your courage to ask questions gave me permission to ask my own. Thank you for showing me that I'm not crazy for having doubts. Your recordings proved what I suspected. This organization fears questions because it can't answer them honestly." Within 6 months of Chen's revelation, multiple governments had launched investigations into Jehovah's Witness practices, particularly regarding child protection policies and shunning practices that separated families. More importantly, thousands of witnesses were quietly leaving the organization. Unlike the typical dramatic exit through disfellowshipping, these were educated, thoughtful departures by people who had done their research and concluded the organization's claims couldn't withstand scrutiny. Support groups formed in major cities worldwide. Online communities provided resources for people transitioning out of the high-control environment. Mental health professionals began specializing in helping former witnesses overcome the psychological effects of authoritarian religious systems. The website we had started as a simple platform for sharing my story had evolved into a comprehensive resource center with legal advice, psychological support, historical documentation, and practical guidance for those questioning or leaving the organization. The personal cost of this journey was significant. I lost what I had thought were friendships but learned were conditional relationships based on shared beliefs rather than genuine affection. Family members who had joined the organization after my conversion also shunned me completely. But the gains were immeasurable. I rediscovered intellectual freedom, the right to question, to doubt, to change my mind when evidence warranted it. I learned to distinguish between truth and comfort, between community and conformity, between faith and fear. Most importantly, I learned that courage is contagious. My willingness to ask uncomfortable questions had given others permission to do the same. My refusal to be silenced had shown others that silence wasn't their only option. I also found unexpected love. Sarah Chen, the web developer who had helped build our platform, shared not just my commitment to the project but my values of intellectual honesty and social justice. We married 2 years after the documentary's release, building a relationship based on genuine compatibility rather than shared indoctrination. The story didn't end with Chen's revelation. His decision to go public had encouraged other high-level witnesses to come forward with their own experiences and documentation. We learned about the organization's sophisticated legal strategies to protect assets while minimizing compensation to abuse victims. We discovered internal discussions about knowingly appointing men with histories of domestic violence to positions of authority. We found evidence of deliberate mistranslation in their Bible to support unique doctrines. Perhaps most disturbing was documentation of their systematic discouragement of education, specifically because educated members asked more questions and were more likely to leave. Each new revelation reinforced the same pattern: an organization more concerned with maintaining power than seeking truth, more invested in protecting its image than protecting its members. 3 years after this journey began, my recordings and documentation have become part of the academic literature on religious control mechanisms. Universities use them in courses on sociology of religion, social psychology, and religious freedom. The recordings provide unique evidence of how thought control operates in real time. Students can hear authority figures using classic manipulation techniques: gaslighting, loyalty testing, information control, and social pressure. Dr. Hassan included extensive analysis of my case in his updated edition of Combating Cult Mind Control, writing, "Paul Martinez's systematic documentation of institutional response to questions provides unprecedented insight into how high control groups maintain power through information suppression." But beyond academic interest, the materials have practical value for people currently trapped in similar situations. They demonstrate that the problem isn't with the questioner but with systems that can't tolerate questioning. Looking back on this experience, I'm struck by how a simple question about biblical chronology led to such profound revelations about institutional power and control. The Jehovah's Witness organization, like many high-control groups, operates on a fundamental contradiction. They claim to love truth while systematically suppressing it. They demand questions from outsiders while punishing questions from insiders. They promise freedom while enforcing conformity. My recordings captured this contradiction in real time. You can hear intelligent, educated men explicitly stating that questioning the organization is inappropriate, that loyalty matters more than accuracy, that institutional preservation justifies intellectual dishonesty. But the recordings also captured something else: the power of persistent, honest questioning to expose these systems for what they really are. Every totalitarian system, whether political or religious, depends on its members' willingness to stop asking questions. The moment people start demanding evidence, accountability, and logical consistency, the system begins to crumble. Today, 5 years after I first asked that innocent question about chronology, the impact continues to ripple outward. The website receives thousands of visitors daily. The documentary has been translated into dozens of languages. Support groups for former witnesses operate in hundreds of cities worldwide. But the most meaningful impact is personal. I regularly receive messages from people who have found the courage to leave oppressive religious environments and rebuild their lives on foundations of intellectual honesty and personal freedom. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specializes in religious trauma syndrome, wrote to me, "Your documentation provides crucial evidence for understanding how institutional gaslighting operates. We're using your recordings in therapeutic settings to help former members recognize manipulation techniques they experienced." Perhaps the most surprising development came 2 years after Chen's public resignation. I received a call from someone I never expected to hear from again, Brother Peterson, the presiding overseer who had first tried to silence me. "Paul," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I need to apologize to you." I was speechless. After Chen's revelations, I started doing my own research. I discovered that everything you were asking about was, well, you were right. About all of it. Peterson explained that he had quietly left the organization 6 months earlier, but only after spending months studying the very materials he had once forbidden me from examining. The hardest part, he admitted, was realizing that I had been part of silencing someone who was asking legitimate questions. I was so invested in the system that I couldn't see I was defending lies. He had called to ask if he could contribute his own recordings to our archive, conversations with circuit overseers and branch representatives where they had discussed how to handle problem members like me. I recorded some of those conversations too, Paul. After what happened with you, I became suspicious of the official narrative. I have evidence of how the organization really operates at higher levels. Peterson's recordings revealed another layer of institutional dysfunction, local elders who privately acknowledged problems but felt pressured to maintain public unity, circuit overseers who received explicit instructions on how to suppress dissent, and branch representatives who prioritized damage control over truth. The accumulating evidence of institutional cover-ups and thought control eventually caught the attention of international human rights organizations. The European Parliament's Committee on Legal Affairs launched an investigation into whether Jehovah's Witness practices violated European Union standards for religious freedom and family unity. I was invited to testify before the committee, presenting my recordings as evidence of how the organization handled internal dissent. The hearing was broadcast live and watched by millions of people worldwide. The most powerful moment came when I played the recording of Davis threatening me with complete social isolation for asking questions. The committee chair, Dr. Elena Marchetti, responded with visible disgust, "This is not religious freedom, this is psychological coercion." The committee's final report concluded that while Jehovah's Witnesses had the right to exist as a religious organization, their shunning practices and suppression of internal dissent violated fundamental human rights principles. Several EU countries began reviewing the organization's tax-exempt status and access to public schools for recruitment. The journey from questioning witness to international advocate for religious freedom has been simultaneously devastating and liberating. I lost the community that had become my entire social world, but I gained something more valuable: intellectual integrity. The psychological impact was significant. Leaving a high-control group creates a unique form of trauma that mainstream psychology is only beginning to understand. The constant questioning of one's own judgment, the fear of making independent decisions, the sense of being fundamentally flawed for having doubts, these effects persist long after physical departure. I spent 2 years in therapy with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who specializes in religious trauma syndrome. Through our work together, I learned to recognize the thought-stopping techniques I had internalized, to trust my own judgment again, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than shared ideology. "Paul," Dr. Walsh told me during one session, "your experience illustrates how intelligent, educated people can be drawn into high-control systems during vulnerable periods. But it also shows how intellectual courage can eventually overcome psychological manipulation." The therapy was crucial because my story had made me a public figure in the ex-cult community, and I needed to process my own trauma while helping others process theirs. My relationship with Sarah Chan deepened as we worked together on expanding the platform and supporting other survivors. Unlike my first marriage, which had been built on shared circumstances rather than shared values, this relationship was founded on mutual respect for intellectual honesty and personal growth. Our wedding was small but meaningful, attended by fellow activists, academic colleagues, and former witnesses who had become genuine friends. Marcus, my college friend who had first questioned my conversion, served as best man. "Paul," he said in his toast, "you've shown all of us that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, courage over conformity. Your journey has inspired hundreds of others to reclaim their intellectual freedom." Sarah and I honeymooned in Greece, visiting archaeological sites that definitively contradicted Watchtower chronology. Standing among ruins that were conclusively dated centuries before the organization claimed possible, I felt a profound sense of closure. I was no longer the confused convert seeking answers from authoritarian leaders. I was a free man capable of evaluating evidence independently. Perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this journey has been working with young people raised in high-control religious environments. Many had been taught that questioning was sinful, that doubt indicated spiritual weakness, that independent thinking was rebellion against God. We established the Critical Thinking Foundation, a non-profit organization providing scholarships for former cult members pursuing higher education, legal support for those facing family separation due to shunning, and therapeutic resources for religious trauma recovery. One of our scholarship recipients, Maria Santos, had been raised as a Jehovah's Witness and shunned by her family when she chose to attend college. She wrote to me after completing her PhD in archaeology, "Paul, Your documentation helped me understand that my desire for education wasn't selfish pride but intellectual integrity. Your courage gave me permission to trust my own mind. These stories multiply daily. Young people who might have spent decades trapped in authoritarian religious systems are instead pursuing education, careers, and relationships of their own choosing. The long-term impact of our documentation and advocacy has been a fundamental shift in how society views high-control religious groups. Legal systems are developing more sophisticated approaches to religious freedom that balance organizational rights with individual protections. Several countries have passed legislation specifically addressing religious shunning practices that separate families. Courts are increasingly recognizing religious trauma as a legitimate form of psychological injury. Universities are developing specialized programs for helping former cult members integrate into mainstream society. The Jehovah's Witness organization itself has been forced to make some modifications, though they consistently claim these changes are new light rather than responses to external pressure. They've slightly relaxed some shunning practices, modified some of their more extreme educational restrictions, and begun acknowledging some historical errors, though always in ways that minimize institutional culpability. But the most significant change has been cultural. The idea that religious organizations should be immune from questioning, that faith requires suppression of doubt, that loyalty trumps truth, these notions are increasingly recognized as psychologically harmful and potentially abusive. As I write this conclusion, sitting in my home office surrounded by books I'm free to read, research I'm free to pursue, and questions I'm free to ask, I often think about that moment in the Kingdom Hall when I first asked about biblical chronology. That single question, innocent, sincere, seeking only understanding, revealed an entire system of thought control that millions of people live under without realizing it. It demonstrated how authoritarian systems respond to challenge, not with evidence or reasoning, but with coercion and intimidation. The recordings I made during those crucial months have become more than just personal documentation. They're historical evidence of how institutional power operates when it believes no one is watching. They show how ordinary people become enforcers of authoritarian systems, how good intentions can be weaponized for control, how the language of love and protection can mask fundamental abuse. But most importantly, they demonstrate that truth has a power that transcends institutional authority. Once people begin asking honest questions and demanding honest answers, no amount of manipulation can permanently suppress their intellectual awakening. My advice to anyone reading this who finds themselves in similar circumstances is straightforward. Trust your mind. Question everything, especially that which demands unquestioning loyalty. Document your interactions with authority figures. Seek independent verification of claims. And remember that any truth worth believing can withstand the most rigorous examination. The organization that once controlled every aspect of my thinking now has no power over me whatsoever. I've built a life based on evidence rather than authority, on questions rather than answers, on intellectual courage rather than comfortable conformity. And it all began with one simple question about biblical chronology, a question that any honest religious organization should have been able to answer without resorting to threats, manipulation, or demands for silence. Never underestimate the power of a single, honest question. It might just change your entire world. Postscript. The Critical Thinking Foundation continues to support individuals leaving high-control religious environments. Our website, questioningfaith.org, provides resources, documentation, and community for those beginning their own journey toward intellectual freedom. Because everyone deserves the right to ask questions and seek honest answers, regardless of what any authority figure might say to the contrary. The complete audio archive of recorded conversations mentioned in this account is available through academic channels for researchers studying religious control mechanisms and institutional abuse. Personal identifying information has been redacted to protect privacy while preserving the evidential value of the recordings. This story, while fictionalized, is based on documented experiences of numerous former Jehovah's Witnesses who have found the courage to ask difficult questions and seek honest answers. The names and specific details have been altered, but the patterns of institutional response are drawn from extensive documentation of actual events.